Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Burning Desire Show. I'm with Carissa Tjia today. The way we came to know each other is quite interesting. It's through my business, which is Allergy, which is the app. You can have a look at that in your own time. And Carissa currently works at FourSquare, and we're looking at a partnership. And then one of Carissa's colleagues, who was on the call as well, mentioned my television background, because Carissa, and also your colleague as well, right, has a television background, if I'm not mistaken. And then, as you'll see in the backdrop of Carissa's shot here, if you're listening on audio, you can't, but if you're watching on YouTube, you can, that there's a little Emmy in the back there. And so, yeah, her colleague was like, "Oh, did you not see the Emmy behind her?" I'm like, "I didn't, honestly," but now it's like glaring. I can see it, and it's really cool. And I was like, "I'd love to know more about the story," and therefore, we arranged this podcast, really. So
it's a thrill to be here. Thank you, Charles.
No, it's cool. It's cool. So again, slightly in the pre-call, we talked about where you grew up, but like for obviously that I've heard that, like tell us kind of where you grew up. I know you've been experienced different countries. That'll be something we'll come to as well, hopefully. But yeah, where did you grow up, and what were you interested in back then? Do you remember when you were younger?
Yes, absolutely. So this is rewinding quite a few years. I hope I'm not aging myself. But yeah, so I spent the majority of my childhood in two countries, specifically Indonesia and Australia. So I spent my early childhood in Indonesia. My family is Chinese Indonesian in terms of ethnicity. And, you know, in 1998, I'm not sure how well you know the Indonesian history, but there was a big riot to overthrow the, I guess, dictator of the time, President Suharto. So there were a lot of riots that were targeting the Chinese minority in the country. So at that point, my parents said, look, you know, we have to think of, you know, our only daughter, Carissa's future. So they ended up applying for, you know, visas or resident visas to live in either Australia or Canada. And luckily we actually got both, and they decided, you know what, Australia is closer to Indonesia. So it just made more sense to be, you know, closer to our family. So yeah, I spent the early part of my childhood in Jakarta, basically up till the end of primary school. And so, yeah, and then I moved to Sydney. English was my second language. So learning English was definitely a challenge. And I, you know, immersed myself in obviously the language once I moved to Australia, started, you know, in a whole new education system, whole new country. Didn't know anyone except for maybe one family that helped us with the migration from Indonesia to Sydney. And yeah, I basically started a whole new life, and Sydney is definitely near and dear to my heart. And it was exciting for me to learn that you're thinking of moving there. Yeah. So I would love to, you know, dive deeper into that at some point. But basically, yes, I went through high school, college, University of Sydney, and actually started my like professional life, I would say, in Sydney in the publishing industry for Thomson Reuters. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but they're basically a finance and legal publishing company. And that was my first kind of taste of, you know, corporate life. That was my first gig there was as a freelance telesales operator. So basically it was, you know, dialing in at 6 a.m. with a long call sheet in front of me, and then just getting down to business, like trying to sell as many publications, both digital and hard copy, as much as possible. So that was
the individuals we try and sell to.
So it was actually a B2B. So it was, our target audience was mainly academics, again, in the finance and legal worlds, as well as professionals, corporate world.
You mentioned, sorry, I didn't catch the exact age. What age were you when you moved from Jakarta to Sydney?
Yeah, I was actually 12. So just at the end of primary school.
Fine. And do you remember, you mentioned a difference in the education system. I always find it's quite interesting for people that live in different countries, how things differ. Do you remember the things that were significantly different between the Australian and the Indonesian system?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in the Indonesian education system, I remember quite vividly that a lot of the material that we were learning had to be memorized or rote learned. There was not a lot of critical thinking behind, you know, some of the homework that we had to do. I found that in Australia, you know, being, you know, in a Western developed world, there was a lot more emphasis on critical thinking, and the answer, you know, your responses to, say, you know, questions in English, for example, were not as black and white, right? There are nuances to your responses. Things are open to interpretation, and you're encouraged to question them and really grapple with the material. And that was something that I had never been encouraged to do as a young girl growing up in Indonesia.
And then, so how does the system work in Australia? Do you, because in the UK, for example, at age, I'm thinking now, I think it's age 15, 16, you start to choose the first like routes or routes, you might say, depending where you're based, as to what subjects you're going to specialize in to a degree. And then when you get to 17, you further kind of specify, and then that leads into your college university experience as to really what you can kind of what you can take. How does that work in the Australian system?
Yes, it's actually quite similar. So you start off in seventh grade, basically learning everything, all the languages that were offered, all the sciences, and then as you go along, you kind of funnel and filter through the subjects and pick, what you like, what you enjoy most, what you don't enjoy. The funny thing about that was that because English was is my second language, it was tough for me to follow the English curriculum in Australia. So I excelled at mathematics. Surprise, because numbers are universal, right? So it's funny. I was only really good at math, but my mom instilled in me to basically not just get better at English, but be on the same level as everyone else who grew up in Australia. So I worked really hard to improve my English. And the funny thing is, by the end, towards the end of high school, I ended up being falling in love with English. I ended up majoring in it in college afterwards. So it's just funny how I pivoted from mathematics being my only subject that I could really rely on excelling at, to actually just pivoting completely to the languages, including French, but mainly English literature. And I just fell in love with, again, how everything was just open to interpretation. There was no, you couldn't be completely, wrong in your interpretation, as long as you can back up your thesis or your argument.
It's interesting. I was talking to someone the other day about English as a language. And I think obviously you've learned as a second language, so you know better than I. It's really hard. Like there's so many like nuances the word you use, and I think that's the best way to describe it. Like like the word like psychology as a silent P, or like all this. So there's just so many little like tiny rules that don't make any sense in the global scheme of things. Whereas like I feel like, again, you've got experience in French, as do I. At least yes, you have male and female, but like, and there's a structure of verbiage. There's a sounds are pretty structured, I would say. But like, yeah, English, you can't rote learn that. It's not possible. Like you just, it's I don't know, how do you learn it? I have no idea.
Absolutely. I mean, just starting with the grammar, I think, was one thing. And like you said, the pronunciation, the phonetics behind, every word and how there are silent syllables. Yeah, I think it was just like kind of starting with the building blocks of the language. Like you couldn't just jump in and start reading a novel, for example. So you really had to break down the words and almost go kind of rewind to their, the syllables of every word. And yeah, it was tough. It was tough learning it while I was, growing up in Indonesia. Like it was, especially in the Indonesian language, there is no, like your verb for past tense and present tense, it stays the same. There is no, conjugating a verb, for example. So that was something I had to definitely learn from a young age and keep practicing at.
So it's interesting you mentioned that your mother was influential in turning your weakness into a passion, a strength, I suppose, within English. You put that down to just sheer hard work and just trying to like, impress or do well by her, that then led into something that you're passionate about. I think it's quite an interesting situation.
Yeah, I think she really wanted me to be able to not just prove to other people, but prove to myself that I can overcome my biggest weakness, which at the time was the English language. So I definitely embraced that. I was definitely up for the challenge. I did not. I guess I was also internally, I wanted to fight the stereotype that Asians are good at mathematics, and I really wanted to break out of that shell from a very young age. Yeah, and I think I must credit some of the English teachers that I had who kind of, guided me at every step in terms of just not just in terms of mastering the subject at school, but also, as I acclimate to a new country and a new environment. So there were definitely a couple of English teachers that I'm, forever grateful for helping me immerse myself into that world.
And when you got to college or university in University of Sydney, right?
Correct.
You is it again in the Australian system? Do you decide up front that I know you majored in English and advanced French?
Mhm.
Do you decide before you go that's what you're gonna do, or do you just enroll into the university or college, and then as you go down the roads, do you start kind of going, all right, I want to take that class and this class, and that leads to a number of points that go towards a major? Is that how it works there?
Yeah, it's actually, yes, you're spot on there. So we do decide what we want to. The degree is quite specialized from the get-go. Whereas I don't know how familiar you are with the American college system, is where you kind of, it's almost like high school version two. And then you start, specializing as you go. But I think at Sydney, it's pretty career oriented in terms of the degrees that you can take. And of course, I picked the one that didn't pigeonhole me into a specific, line of profession. And that was definitely, I would say, one of like an anomaly among my circle of friends, for example, because they were certain they were going to be a lawyer. So they, did a Bachelor of Laws or a science or medicine. So
were you doing like the studies was it more about like the literature, or was it language, a bit of both, what you were studying?
Yeah, it was definitely more literature focused. So a lot of essays, 2,500, 5,000 word essays. I enjoyed the research aspect of my degree, but I must be honest, I was very, the other thing that my mom instilled in me was working, like earning money. So I actually entered the workforce when I was 15. So I was still in high school, quite young. I worked at my local library. But I must say that for me, I could have been more immersed in my degree or in, campus life, because I was actually a bit distracted because I actually held that full-time job I mentioned at Thomson Reuters at the publishing company. So I must say
college.
Yes, exactly. It was during full-time studies and full-time work. So it was definitely tough juggling the two, but I loved the rigor of that professional environment and just being able to, save up for what I wanted.
So the Thomson job, was that a bit of was there any reason why you chose that particular company, or just the way it just happened? You applied to a bunch of places and they took you. Was it more about that at that point?
Exactly. Yeah, I applied to a bunch of places. Prior to that, I had been working at a stationery and bookstore, so I wanted to just get my feet wet in the corporate world. So that's the opportunity that came up, and I honestly thought that was one of the best like first corporate jobs a young girl could ever ask for, because you were thrown in at the deep end. I was in the sales world, and selling skills, it helps you all through life in all aspects of life. So it was really great to get in kind of very early, and I was the youngest in the company. It was great. I had some great mentors that I really looked up to.
So was it the whole time you spent at Thomson Reuters, was it like 2 or 3 years, if I'm not mistaken? Was the whole time in the sales force, or did you move within the company?
Yeah, sales and advertising were kind of the departments I worked in. Yes. I honestly, it was, like I said, the great introduction to the corporate world. And then towards the end of my college years, that's when I took a prolonged vacation in Jakarta just to spend more time with my grandparents. And then the opportunity to intern at a TV station in Jakarta actually came up during my, holiday. I thought I was just there to spend time with family, but then one of the English speaking shows on a local network there needed extra help, especially with someone who is able to speak English. And so I signed up for it, and my 3-week holiday ended up being a 2-month holiday, or a 2-month working holiday at that point. And that was my first foray into television production, specifically in the news section.
And so I guess you must have thoroughly enjoyed that, right? Because you then went on to a career within there. So what aspects of that kind of world, obviously it's very different to what you've done previously, and you kind of, I guess, fell into it. Like, what did you really love about the TV space?
Yeah, I mean, I love the environment. Like it's very hands-on. First of all, you're not just sitting behind a desk all day. You're in the control room, you're running around to different, editing rooms or editing bays. Like I enjoyed that I wasn't, behind a desk from 9 to 5. That was definitely a big thing that I noticed from the get-go. The other thing that I really enjoyed was that the words that I scripted, so the words that I put into a script actually ended up on air. And it's amazing. Like for an intern, for a young intern, not to have your work almost, it wasn't edited by anyone.
Wow.
Like every single word I wrote on the, and at the time I was just writing it on paper, ended up being spoken by the anchor of
Wow.
the show on, the national network. So yeah, that was delightful for me. I didn't know that it was, quote unquote, that easy for my writing or my words to be put on screen. And this is a question I get a lot is, did you ever consider, being on camera talent? And honestly, no, because I like that I got, I like I have so much respect for a lot of on-camera talent, but I just never saw myself in that light. I liked being able to control the narrative and control the content, especially in my later years. I noticed that on-camera talent, sometimes they don't have time to dive deep into a story and do the research behind it and come up with their own scripts. So I like being on the producer side of things where I get to control the narrative that way.
So you do the 3 month stint in Indonesia. Then do you go back to Sydney? Like what happens next?
Yeah, it was a 2 month internship. My life was still, calling in Sydney. My whole family was in Sydney. So after that, I decided, what, when I go back to Sydney, I'm going to pursue a career in broadcast
Nice.
production. That was when I decided, I fell in love with that world. I wanted to know what it was like in Sydney to work in that industry because I had never been exposed to it. And yeah, I was very determined. I started just emailing a bunch of networks. And luckily, I got an internship again in Sydney. And I still had about a semester of university left. So I was very distracted again by this newfound love of television production. And so I emailed one of the executive producers and supervising producers at a network called Seven Network in Sydney, and she happened to be an alumna from my high school. So I think that helped, get my foot in the door and get that that internship spot. And at the time, it was completely unpaid. So again, I was very lucky that I was still living at home and able to support, myself in during that free internship.
And was that the morning show, or was that a little bit after that?
Yeah, that was the morning show. That was actually the only show I worked on in Australia. But yeah, again, it was another like eye-opening experience. Because for me, the television world had been this like mysterious kind of bubble that like I didn't know anyone who had successfully, broken into that field. And then yeah, it was a godsend to just be able to find, an alumna in that field. I think that was very, very coincidental and very, very fortunate. And then, yeah, and just to be able to see, like from an intern's perspective, again, I wasn't getting coffee, right? I was actually, again, starting to write stories and pitch ideas. And it really just helped me get a feel for the field. And of course, it was a bonus to, brush, to bump into different celebrities who were visiting for the show. And it was, even though it was an Australian network, we definitely had a lot of international guests too. So yeah, it was a great exposure. And I was definitely swept up in the excitement of it all.
What kind of guests did you have on the show that you kind of brushed shoulders with?
Yeah, I think definitely a lot of TV stars, the stars. I remember at that time, Psy, the Korean singer, was definitely, the talk of the town and talk of the world really after his video went viral. So we had a concert at the network and I got to meet him, and I have a little brother, he got to come along with me, so that was really nice. But yeah, I also I also met up with like a lot of like I would produce the segments that had these celebrity interviews. So I think one memorable one was the One Direction. When they came, there was a sea of fans just outside of the network. Like it was very hard for us who worked there to get in and out of the network. So just yeah, that was definitely one. But yeah, a lot of entertainment personalities visited our show.
So you do the internship whilst you're finishing your studies, your final semester, you finish your studies, and then do you go back as an intern, or you just continued the internship effectively?
Yeah, I continued on as a freelance producer. So after 3 months of the unpaid internship, I was hired as a freelance producer for 3 months and then became a permanent full-time producer there at the morning show.
I know it's a big thing in TV, this kind of unpaid internship piece. Like, what's your view on that now? Obviously, you've got more experience in the working world. Do you think it's fair? Do you think it's a rite of passage? Do you think it's taking advantage? Like, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think some pay is definitely necessary because I know not a lot of people are in a position to just work for free. A lot of students, a lot of young professionals need just to sustain their life. Even if it's just the basic needs like like food and living expenses. So I do think it would be better if every network offered paid internship. Yeah.
And so your career then with the morning show, did you just like, what sort of show, you mentioned you produced some celebrity spots, like what other sort of things were you doing production wise? And for people that don't understand, like what does a producer actually do? Like what's the role?
That's a very good question. That's a question I definitely have received over the years. So producer is, I would say, almost like a puppet master behind the scenes in a way. I think that's a good analogy because you have to have an aerial view or a bird's eye view of all the moving parts that go into producing a show, and especially a live broadcast show. I think there is a tenacity that's necessary in this in that role, because you're not only grappling with internal stakeholders, internal like moving parts, but also externally, right? So there's got to be a tenacity in, for example, just booking the talent, because other networks want, the talent that's, that everyone is vying for a particular story. So just getting there first was definitely a key aspect of the role, and then just being persistent. I think persistence is a big part of that role, and that's what kind of set me up for the rest of my career, because there's a lot of rejection in that field, not just from trying to book talent, but also in terms of your career, and just trying to get that producer title was not easy, and it isn't easy across the board, whether it's in Australia or America, from my experience. So just building that thicker, like kind of having a thicker skin just from dealing with rejection, and not taking your work so personally, like I think we talked about previously, like just having that boundary between, I guess, who you are as a person and what you do, I think was really important, because if your whole identity is wrapped up in what you do, then who are you outside of that environment? So that was definitely a question that I had to grapple with as I immersed myself and got deeper and deeper into the world of TV production. But yeah, in terms of just basically what a producer does, it's you kind of control every moving part. So whether it's the talent that you're trying to get on the show, the script, like what's the angle here, like why should an audience who's watching at home care about your segment? So that was one of the big questions we had to ask, and if we can't answer that question easily, then it's not a segment worth airing, right? And then everything from writing scripts and preparing the questions for the anchors to ask the guests, and depending on the nature of the segment. But yeah, from writing, so there's a lot of writing, there's a lot of interviewing, like pre-interviewing talent, making sure they're set up for the show. And I guess the other part is just being immersed in the story, like whatever story we're covering, just making sure we're showing as many sides to the story as possible, because it's amazing how much influence producers have. And I'm sure you having been on The Apprentice, what goes on behind the scenes, and how much how much influence a producer can have on what an audience receives at home. So I think that's a big responsibility that can be taken for granted sometimes, and and that falls on the producer.
Were there any particularly memorable like segments or stories that you covered during your time at the morning show in Australia that kind of would you want to share?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of the so we covered a lot of news from the US as well. Like I think Hurricane Sandy was a big deal, not only for Americans but also internationally. Like even though it didn't affect us immediately, just just seeing the footage from that disaster was definitely eye-opening. And I remember being, I think it happened on a weekend, and I was the only producer on staff that weekend. So we have a very skeleton staff on the weekend. So just being kind of the go-to person and just taking responsibility for like what the information that we're getting, right? Making sure it's accurate, cross-referencing different sources, and just I definitely remember taking that responsibility very seriously because, people, especially when it's a story where people, were hurt, they're victims, like making sure that we're presenting the story in the most accurate way possible. And again, considering all voices involved. So that I remember thinking, wow, I'm the only one here in the studio. I really need to make sure that I cross my T's and dot my I's and make sure the story is what it needs to be. Yeah,
It's really interesting. I read about this a lot in different books and memoirs and people that I come across in these sort of podcasts that I do, that like these small like moments that have like changed the course of your life. For example, with yourself, you mentioned obviously moving back to Indonesia, spend time with your family there, and then falling into this opportunity with in the entertainment business, which led to the Emmy, which we'll come on to soon. It's really amazing, right? That these small things can make such a big difference when we look back at them. But I guess you also have to, the serendipity of it, but you also have to at the same time put yourself forward and be in a position to take the opportunity, right? As well as it being presenting to itself, which I find interesting. What size was the audience actually of the morning show, for example? Like how many people would tune into that?
that's a good question. Definitely, I think it was just just a little over 1 million. The Australian market is obviously quite small compared to New York or the US. And actually that leads me to like one of the reasons I decided to move to New York. Yeah, was because I was already producer in my early 20s. I was at the, one of the biggest networks in Australia already. It was, the top morning show for that time slot. It's like, where to from here? I started asking myself that question. And that's what led me to basically, I left my job about like just a couple of weeks after receiving an offer, just, for a raise or promotion. And I very gracefully just declined the offer and said, look, I need to see what's out there, what's in New York, being, the hub of journalism, especially news production. So I was very determined at a young age to make sure that, I at least, try to see what's out there, because I didn't want to live the rest of my life wondering what if.
That's awesome. Where do you think that comes from? Like, is that instilled from your parents, your family, or you just kind of, I don't know. I'm curious.
It's funny because my parents never, they were very, encouraging in terms of, I can do anything I want to do. But they never, said, you should try New York or try a different market. Like they never pushed me in that direction. I would say that my first taste of New York came actually earlier when I spent a semester in New York as a 10th grader, just on an exchange program. So I got my first taste of New York. So that was another seed that was planted early on that gave me that courage to, and, desire to pursue a life in New York.
Wow. So you decide you want to, explore New York. Like, explain how that process then works. Like, was it easy to get a visa? Did you get the job first? Like, what happened?
Yeah. So although I spent most of my childhood in Indonesia and Australia, I was actually born in the US. So luckily enough, I do have an American passport, and that really helped in terms of, so that's again, credit to my parents. They went to school here, but they knew they weren't going to live here. So they thought, okay, let's make sure when our daughter is born, she's born in the US, so that any life. Exactly. It's like, it was just, again, they were, very forward thinking in that way. And they knew, they never pushed me to come back to the US, but they knew they wanted me to have that option. Awesome. Right. So I actually got to skip all the bureaucratic, paperwork that comes with visa applications. I'm very, very grateful for that. But yeah, when I came here, I'd only kept in touch, I think, with one person that I kept in touch from my exchange. And so they helped me get set up a little bit. But honestly, I just kind of went on Craigslist and went and looked for a room, in Tribeca, got a room there. And and just started applying for jobs. I didn't have a job waiting for me when I got here. I didn't have an apartment to live in. It was, kind of a month-to-month basis.
Wow.
So I just decided to pack up my life and just see. It was just that question, like, I don't want to regret not taking this chance while, especially while I was younger and wondering what if. So that was like the main driver for me. And and when I got here in November. I arrived in November, and then I was looking for apartments. I couldn't even create a bank account because I didn't have social security number. My parents had not given me a social security number because they knew we were leaving the country. They didn't see the point. So that was a whole ordeal, just trying to get a social security number. That's very important here, and just kind of going through the interview process for that, especially when the officials saw that I had grown up in Indonesia, which is like a red alert country for terrorism, and this is post 9/11, right?
Okay.
So there was a whole kind of interrogation process that I had to go through to basically prove that I wasn't training with terrorists while I grew up in Indonesia. So that was definitely the first hurdle I faced when I moved here. But other than that, it's just, leasing an apartment, again, with no credit history. I had never owned a credit card before I moved here. No social security record other than, from when the application came through. I was looking for a job, looking for an apartment in a new country, definitely unfamiliar to me because I left when I was a baby. So I don't have connections here in New York specifically. And just trying to set up a new life. It was honestly quite thrilling. Like, as scary as it was also thrilling at the same time. Like, it was very exciting for me as a young girl. It was my first kind of experience living outside of, my family home. So it was a great experience.
That's awesome. And did you then just up from applying, is that where Good Morning America, the role came there, or was there something before that happened?
There was definitely something before that. The springboard to that was again, Craigslist was my best friend when I first moved to New York. I actually got a part-time job at a TV studio, so like a TV recording studio. So they do like satellite links for interviews. So guests would come to the studio, and then I have an interview with Good Morning America or some other show, and then they leave. So I actually was a studio operator for just a couple of months, so that December-January period. And during that time, I was actively looking for producer roles because I knew that I already had that producer background from Australia. I just wasn't sure how it would be acknowledged here in the US market. I ended up emailing a bunch of networks. I had some like fun informational interviews. I remember just emailing the executive producer of a CNN show and not expecting much from it. And it was very like, "Hi, I'm Carissa. I just came from Australia." It was very innocent email. And he actually sat down with me. He offered me a freelance job. But the funny thing is that happened at the same time as the Good Morning America opportunity came, and that was a more permanent job. So I definitely ended up going with the Good Morning America show. But again, it just involved with emailing a lot of people, trying to see if anyone in my network was in that field, and that's how you can get your foot in the door.
It's so true. I think someone asked me that with a friend last night and was asking me like how, for example, I think I mentioned this interview. A friend was like, "Oh, how do you like come across these people?" And it's like, you're right. It's persistent. It's like, I think it's a Richard Branson quote. I'm paraphrasing, but he basically says, if you're trying to get like the A player in an industry, trying to get like Elon Musk, whatever, like, good luck. Like, it's not going to happen. But like the tiers below that are still super successful and interesting, or whatever else, like, you'd be surprised. Not people really take the time to just reach out with a straightforward email or whatever the case may be. And as is the case with you, just actually putting the time in and finding out who they are, a bit about them maybe or something. You'd be amazed how much people are willing to help. I think, again, we grew up in this world now, like, we all think everyone's out for themselves and maybe a bit cynical and, and who's helping each other. And I think actually there are lots of people out there, as I'm sure you'll attest to, that are genuinely just trying to help where they can. And we'll offer the advice if they can, or a position or whatever the case may be. I think, people just need to reach out more. And I don't like the word networking, because I think people think it's like, this is really like, you've got to be a certain way and you've got to act a certain way and you've got to be in a certain meeting. But like, use the tools available like LinkedIn, or you can find email addresses almost anywhere now of most people. And yeah, if you just like smart with it and you box clever, as my trainer says, like, you'd be amazed what you can get and who you can get to meet, and where that might lead.
Exactly. And I'm a big believer in, you lose out on 100% of the chances you don't take. So um, there is a way to do it without, being a pest, and, there's a polite way to do these things. And I think that's important to be mindful of. But again, if you don't take the chance, and like I said, like getting 1,000 no's is better than, not knowing, what, and again, wondering what if. So
Very
totally
true.
on the same page as you there.
Very, very true. So you start in Good Morning America, and are you starting as a producer there, or is it different title, the same thing? Like, how's that work?
Yeah, I was actually started as a production assistant. So I would say that's a glorified intern. It's like one step up from intern. Again, it was a great experience in that none of my internships, involved me getting coffee. I know that's kind of the stereotype with internships. So I love that I got to just get very hands-on. Like, it was definitely a steep learning curve, because again, the Australian market is different from the US market. I quickly noticed that the stories in the US, news shows are a lot faster paced. So just getting to the point, like not burying, the lead was one of the kind of golden nuggets that we had to keep in mind as we put together these scripts. It's just, it's just a lot faster paced. Like, you really get to the point up front, and then you dive deeper, instead of kind of working your way up to making your final point and kind of nailing it at the end. So there was definitely some nuances like that I noticed early on, and I definitely had to adjust my writing style. Again, I met some great, veteran producers at this point who definitely showed me the ropes. And definitely just had to pick it up very quickly, because when you're with something that I've noticed from just looking back at my career is that I definitely have had to learn on the job. I learned the best from a hands-on manner, right? I'm not one to sit in a classroom, kind of in an academic setting and just kind of absorb, content from a textbook or be just being lectured at. I definitely enjoy being hands-on with things. So I think that's what the internships and this production assistant role allowed me to do.
I'm interested if you, I'm sure you've come across it, or if you've watched it or not, the Apple series called The Morning Show. Have you ever watched it?
Yeah, I did watch 2 episodes. I must say it kind of hit very close to home. Obviously, with a show like that, there's a lot of exaggeration, but there is some grain of truth in it.
Yeah. I had to ask. Like, I just, particularly as you also worked on The Morning Show in Australia.
Exactly.
Like, so Good Morning America, like you said, did the stories also differ, like as compared to The Morning Show in Australia, or was it kind of the same? Just as you said, just the way they were told was different.
I would say the stories. I found like pitching ideas for stories was definitely a lot harder in the US. Like, there was a higher bar for originality, making sure the angle was specific, and like, you can't pitch a story that's too broad. You have to have a very specific angle. There was definitely a higher bar for I think we had this like group distribution email where you saw everyone's pitches as well as your own, and you can see kind of the variety and kind of the rigor behind each pitch. And every producer, had the story that they would fight for. And I definitely was in some of those battles myself. So I just remember never having to fight for a story as much as I did at Good Morning America. And that was, again, a good learning experience there. Other than, I would say, the pacing of the stories also, obviously we had a lot more resources at Good Morning America than in Australia. So just having that broad network of, international talent in different countries, depending on where the story is. I must say one of my most memorable experiences as a GMA producer was when I was covering breaking news, specifically the plane crashes. One of them was an Air Asia airplane that crashed near Malaysia, and then the Malay airline that crashed in in Asia, in the Pacific as well, I believe. And yeah, so that was a breaking news story. You know, we were trying to stay on top of it. But the funny thing is, I have that link to Indonesia in terms of the language, so I was able to understand the press conferences that were coming out. So they did, the network didn't need to hire a translator. I was kind of there, you know, at their news desk. I was pulled to their news desk to be able to just funnel, you know, facts and information through the entire network. So that was, you know, I felt that was a very big responsibility. But sadly, for one of those stories, actually some family members were on the plane that was shot in Ukraine, or near Ukraine, and it was you know, I got a FaceTime call from my mom, and she was sobbing, and she was telling me, oh my gosh, our cousins were on that plane. They were on their way from Amsterdam to Malaysia. So that definitely was a, you know, a very hard, you know, long shift for me. I think I ended up working like 15 hours that night, again, helping coverage of the story, but also, you know, trying to console my family. And yeah, it was just, that was the one instant where kind of my personal life, you know, crossed my professional life in a very, you know, tangible way. So yeah, so that was definitely one shift that I will not forget.
In terms of like pitching ideas, because again, this is obviously something relevant to if you're in business or in any capacity, really. You know, you always kind of, you mentioned something earlier which I really liked about the Thomson Reuters job, where you learn the sales skills that are important for life. Like you know, when you're deciding where you want to go for dinner with your partner, you're selling. Like people don't realize that you're constantly influencing. Maybe that's a better word because people hate the word sales, but you're constantly influencing or trying to get your point across. And you want to go for a walk, like you've got to kind of, you know, present it in a way that's like, you know, someone wants to go with you or whatever the case may be, or coffee or whatever. So that's very valid. In terms of pitching ideas, like, can you give us an example of like an idea that you thought was great, but for some reason didn't make it, and then like something that did make it, maybe why those things might have happened?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I would say, you know, there were so many pitches, so I'm not sure I can think of one like on top of my head right now, but just a bit more broadly, I think just finding a specific angle to a story, right? Because a story isn't a full-fledged story until there's, you know, a point of view on it. And that's where kind of, you know, news, you know, you try to be objective and you're presenting the facts, but whether you like it or not, there's always an angle to a story. Like it's hard, it's not, you know, it's not a checklist of just facts, right? There's no entertainment value in that. And television, you know, even on the news side, it does, you know, thrive on entertainment value too. So basically finding that angle that's unique, that's not, you know, that's not already in the headline of every, you know, article you Google, I think is important. And just asking yourself, you know, what am I missing here? Because as in life, you know, we all have our blind spots, and being able to just first of all be aware that we all have blind spots, and then, you know, and then doing your research, asking people around you, hey, what do you think of this? Like, I think bouncing off ideas with colleagues, and even, you know, colleagues from outside your particular field is very, very helpful, because you don't know like what kind of perspective they have on a story, and you may have missed it. So I think that's really important. And yeah, I think pitching is a great skill. And again, in my current work, I think pitching has pivoted more to negotiating, right? And I'm sure you're very familiar with how important negotiating is, not just in the business world, but also in life, like you said, in day-to-day life with your personal relationships as well.
Did you find at times, you alluded to it a little bit there, that there's like, maybe, I don't know, Good Morning America, like politically, where does it skew, or if it does it skew?
Yeah, I think it's more on the left side of things. It's more liberal, less conservative for sure. Yeah.
Did you find ever that the political agenda or the angles that were being used were ever against your like personal views? You just had to kind of suck it up and deal with it, like that kind of thing?
I mean, I will never kind of agree with you know, the network or their point of view 100%. And yeah, that is definitely something that every producer has to grapple with. Luckily, it never collided with my views so much to the point where, you know, I just couldn't, you know, take the story and produce it. So especially because our show, as much as there's like kind of hard news in the first half hour, but then everything else is more entertainment based. I definitely did not encounter that as much as maybe some of my other colleagues who did the primetime news, for example.
That makes sense. And it brings us on to, I guess it's the Emmy behind you, but having looked into it, you won more than one Emmy, is that correct? Or from the work you did, is that correct?
Yeah. So I actually won. So I won 2 Emmys. Our show was, nominated for a bunch every year, but we finally kind of won that one year in 2016. So one of my Emmys is just for the general, like Good Morning America, just for being a producer on Good Morning America. So our whole show won as I think the best morning show that year. And then more specifically, the second Emmy that I won was for a breaking news coverage of the very tragic shooting at the Orlando nightclub. This was, I think, again in mid 2016. And the funny, well, it's not funny, but the strange kind of coincidence here is that I was filling in for a producer or the lead producer for the weekend Good Morning America show. So I was filling in as the supervising producer. So I was basically, so this was kind of my first foray into kind of leading the team instead of just being a producer working on a specific story. I was actually overlooking the whole show and looking at the rundown and making sure things were where they needed to be, again keeping an eye on stories that were coming in, just making decisions on whether this story should stay, this story should go. So this was a new role for me. I wasn't used to being in that position before. And then this is when this story came out, and I remember starting work at 2 p.m. and I was slated to go till maybe around 4 a.m., which is when the morning team comes in for that morning show. So I was, kind of almost like getting ready to leave. Like by the time it was 3 a.m., I was, kind of packing up, I'm ready. I have my notes to hand off to the morning team. And then I was ready to go home. And then this news, like just slow, like news tidbits about a shooting in Orlando started coming in. It came in at around 3:03, like 3:10, and I was trying to decide, is this like, how big is this story? Because as you probably know, like the shootings happen in local neighborhoods, unfortunately, in America, quite frequently. So I was trying to gauge how big a story this was. And the thing is, it was up to me to quote unquote mobilize the troops, right? Because a lot of our senior executive producers, they were all asleep at that time. They weren't up yet to come in later. So I had to make the decision whether to basically mobilize our camera crew in Florida, and making sure that everyone was kind of where they needed to be. Like it's a lot of resources to mobilize if the story wasn't worth doing all that for. And it was on me to decide whether to do that. And I, as more and more information came in, I decided, this is not just your average incident. So I made the call. I called my executive producer and said, sorry to wake you up, but there's a big story. We might need to throw out our whole rundown and just cover the story. And we did. The whole show that morning just focused on it was at the time the biggest mass shooting in US history. I think about almost 50 people lost their lives. So it was very tragic. It was very it was a very hard story to cover, especially because it happened also so close to our show. Our show started, taping at 7 a.m. So we only had a couple hours, and basically the work that that my team and I did from the day before was all thrown out. So it was I think I worked 22 hours that day, or that shift. So it was a very long day, very hard day. And and it wasn't, and I think it was hard for me to, I think every producer has experienced this, where you're covering, an emotional, a tragic story, but you just have to almost detach yourself a little bit from the emotions and just the show must go on.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And then, am I right? I think you then moved totally outside of the television world. Is that correct? The next thing?
Yeah. So after 3 years at Good Morning America, I wanted to, see what else is out there. And also the hours, as you have noticed, were quite challenging, right? Like for, to be pulling, 12-hour shifts, 22-hour shifts, like that is, sure, there's not such a major breaking news story every day, but it does take a toll on you. And I worked overnight as well. And I have so much respect for, everyone who works, the graveyard shift, as they call it. So, because it does, especially for someone who likes working during the day and was a morning person at some point, it was very hard to sustain that. So yeah, after 3 years of working those very intense hours, I was craving something more stable, something kind of like a 9 to 5, which is, I know what some people try to avoid, but for me that seemed very appealing at the time, and I just needed to rest. So actually spent about a year and a half just recuperating from those really taxing, like physically and mentally, taxing years. I was definitely burned out from those all that work, and I just needed to again figure out who I was outside of Carissa, the producer, and yeah, I definitely was lucky enough to have enough savings to just kind of take my time and see what's next. And by the time I was kind of ready to jump back into work, I actually just came across a marketing role. And I have friends in marketing, and I always was kind of interested in it, but I'd never been in that field before. And then I ended up just, working for a nonprofit and did some marketing and communications work for them, while I try to figure out what's next. Like, what is for someone who'd been in the TV world for most of her career, it was definitely not easy trying to find what's next. And honestly, I just kind of stayed open. I wasn't targeting anything. Again, after years of just being a hunter, like in my job and in my life and in my work, just hunting for certain things, always having kind of the next target in mind, to not having anything. That was quite a life-changing experience, in that it was the first time that I felt lost and I didn't have a clear direction for myself. And and I kind of just was open to whatever came my way, and I just asked around, talked to different people, and kind of just want to hear their story and what they do and what they enjoy and don't enjoy, and just kind of figure it out from there. So yeah, this marketing role that I did with the nonprofit was definitely kind of a nice breather. It was again just a way for me to find myself again, I guess.
So you did the marketing role for a few years, and I guess within there, you've found things that you really enjoyed, and you found things that you maybe didn't enjoy so much, and you maybe reflect upon your TV career and you go, right, I really love that part about it, but maybe not this part. And is that how you slowly meandered to then through to Apple, then to FourSquare? Is that kind of how that came to be?
Yeah, I think I heard you in one of your previous episodes that you really like that quote from Steve Jobs about connecting the dots when you look backward. Yeah.
I try almost like want to use it every episode, but pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, but that's so true, and that's exactly what I was doing as I kind of stumbled here and there and looking for my next thing. Was that I just, like you said, connected the dots, looked back on my career and saw what could be transferable to other fields. And the funny thing is, at that time, I was actually thinking of moving to Switzerland, because I've always had this fascination with Switzerland. Again, I'd spent a summer just going to a French program when I was 14, and I just fell in love, and I would love to live there maybe when I'm in a few years. But at the time, I was very, there was nothing kind of holding me back, in New York. So I thought, what? The whole world is there. Like, where do I want to live next? And having lived in other countries growing up, I've always had that propensity to explore and live. I would say I'm a serial mover instead of a serial tourist. Like, I love the idea of living and working in a place instead of just visiting it on vacation. So that was what intrigued me about Switzerland. So then I started applying to jobs in Switzerland, and one of them was at Apple. So I applied for a job at Apple, at an Apple store in Switzerland. And they called me for an interview here in New York instead. So, when Apple comes calling, you say, I decided to say yes. I was, I'd already been an Apple, user. I remember graduating from university. My first gift to myself was getting my first iPhone. So that was always my memory of my first experience with Apple. So yeah, I answered a call for an interview at the flagship, 24-hour store at Fifth Avenue here in New York. And yeah, and then I just said yes to a part-time role because I was still doing the marketing job during the day. So I just thought, you know what, why not meet some, cool people. I'd always heard that people who worked at Apple were just very fun. I'm sure you've walked into an Apple store and became friends with someone who worked there. So yeah, that was so I said yes to that, and I didn't know where that would lead. So yeah, I juggled the two jobs pretty much through pandemic. Like even in the beginning of the pandemic, I was still juggling two jobs, and then the nonprofit wasn't able to sustain me on the payroll because of the pandemic. So then I just went full time with Apple. But yeah, I worked at the Apple store for about 7 months before we all went remote.
Nice.
Yeah.
And then from there, you went to FourSquare, and how did that come about?
Yeah, so it actually started, I would say working at the Apple store is definitely different from like the corporate side of tech, right?
Mhm.
So one thing that Apple offers its retail employees is what's called a career experience. So it's basically an internal 6-month stint to get a taste or some experience in the corporate side of Apple. So that was a program that I applied for, and I was offered a position with the Apple Pay team on the business development side. So that was my first taste of, the corporate tech world, was actually, through the store and then applying for that internal program and getting it and spending 6 months working with the team that's based in Cupertino. But because of the pandemic, I was doing it remotely from home in New York. So yeah, that was, and that's the experience that opened many doors. After, I knew there was an end date to that experience, and I didn't really think I was ready to go back to the store. I wanted to see what's next in that business development world. And I started applying to different tech companies here in New York and California, but more so in New York. And I actually ended up receiving a couple of offers, one from a data science AI company also based here, and FourSquare. And I mean, I'm really grateful for that 6-month experience at Apple Pay because it did open a lot of doors. I think I interviewed with 10 different companies, ended up getting 2 offers out of the 10. So yeah, so that's how kind of, again, I did not plan any of this because again, like, as you know, I was still kind of looking, just being open to what's out there, and that's how it turned out. And now I'm at FourSquare.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. I'm just curious, for Apple Pay, what were you doing in that role?
Yeah, so the team's goal was to onboard as many merchants as possible to have Apple Pay as a payment option, whether it's on their website, on their e-commerce website, or their apps. So basically just reaching out to different businesses. So we would actually kind of go on people's, store e-commerce websites and see, oh, if I purchase something, can I use Apple Pay to pay for the item? So if it's a no, then, we go after them and reach out to them and see if they would be open to putting Apple Pay on their website. So it was, and the big misconception is that, people think these, merchants have to pay to put Apple Pay on their website, but actually Apple Pay is completely free for both its merchants and the end user and the end customer. We're not like Visa, they're not like Visa or MasterCard who have, a processing fee. So yeah, so that was what I did. And I would say, again, it was my first taste of kind of the corporate tech world. And yeah, it was, I learned a lot in terms of, Apple has, a kind of that clout, right, that comes with Apple, and reaching out, you don't have to explain who Apple is when you're doing your outreach to various people. Yeah, so that definitely helped, but it's, you don't want to, I think there's a humility to Apple and how, the culture that makes sure that, we're really coming in from like a helpful point of view, and we're trying to help these businesses, especially the smaller businesses, just get more transactions, get more payment traffic through their properties.
And now with FourSquare in the business development world again, what have you? So I think it's really interesting how your career's gone so like in so many different directions, and you've constantly looked for different challenges, whether it's moving countries or cities or what have you. What advice would you have for someone, either whether they're starting out in a career, they're not sure whether they want to go, or they're in the middle of a career and they're kind of, am I passionate about it, am I not? Like, I think a lot of people are in that space, and after the pandemic as well, I think people have kind of maybe taken a bit of a pause and gone, do I really enjoy what I'm doing? Like, what's your advice as to how to follow your passions more, I guess, like how you've done that?
Yeah, I think the first step, I mean, I first of all, I just want to say I don't have all the answers. I'm also still learning as I go, but I would say that one of the first steps is just to take the chances that you've been itching to take and maybe had put off due to, circumstances, more urgent life things come up, and as we all know. So just going back to kind of seeing like where you, like those like little like I guess nudges in your head that say, oh, try this, try that, just seeing where those may have pointed and where you may have suppressed, that side of things previously, and just kind of starting there, and then just saying yes to a lot of new experiences, right? And even if you end up in, a place that you don't enjoy or a work that you don't enjoy, at least you know what you don't want. And I think that helps you kind of filter out what you don't enjoy doing. And I think it's a process of elimination for me anyway. Like, as you said, my career path has not been linear, and it's taken a lot of experimentation and just kind of trying new things and learning on the way. So I would say for those of us who aren't following a linear path, I think it just takes a lot of experimentation and just not being afraid to take those chances. And I think some of the best experiences in my career have been just from the things that were outside of my plan, or what I had imagined.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. Do you know where you're trying to go next, or you're just enjoying your time at FourSquare and see where that goes right now?
Yeah, I'm definitely enjoying it. Definitely learning a lot about the location technology, location intelligence. Definitely working a lot with data, which is not something I've been exposed to a lot in my career. And I'm really actually excited that I'm taking a strategic negotiations course at Harvard Business School. It's just a 1 week kind of boot camp in March, and I'm really excited because I've always been like you, as we kind of touched on in this episode, in this conversation. We talked about sales skills, pitching, and then I think I mentioned negotiation. And negotiation, I think, again, is one of those skills that you can apply to any field with anyone you're interacting with. And I've always kind of negotiated by instinct, and I try to be as strategic as possible. But I think having some frameworks as a guide would really kind of help take that to the next level. So that's definitely a skill that I'm focused on improving on, and just building that confidence with practice from my current work at FourSquare. So yeah, that's definitely what's next for me. And just one thing to answer your earlier question about advice, but it's not advice, it's more like a tip, is that it's okay for your dreams to evolve and change over time. Like, I started in television thinking I would be in that field for the rest of my life, and it's okay. Like, it's okay to change your mind and find something new. I think I think it's not helpful to anyone, to pigeonhole yourself in a specific field, and again, making that your identity. And I love that, you yourself, having been on The Apprentice and with your current app development work, and I think you were in the jewelry business for a while. Like, I think it's so great to have, again, just a wealth of experiences that you can't really buy with money or anything like that. It's just from trying out and being exposed to different things. And I'm a big believer in that, and just being exposed to as many new things as possible.
Awesome. Well, listen, it's been a very, very interesting interview. I thought it would be, but you never quite know where these things go. But I've really enjoyed talking to you and hearing your story. And I'm sure I'm gonna have to speak to you afterwards about the Sydney situation and some other things besides.
Definitely. No, it's been a pleasure. And I look forward to, maybe meeting up with you in Sydney at some point. Hopefully they open the borders to, to foreigners, non-Australians, non-citizens, non-residents soon.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for your time, Carissa.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Charles.